right? To recap, we basically created a WebSocket channel. We sent a request from the JavaScript from the front end, right, to create a message. We handled it on the server, so we looked at the message, we saved it in the database, and then we returned some HTML as part of a broadcast. So we broadcast out to everyone the HTML for the messages. And the final thing we did was on the front end, once we received that message back, we went ahead and added that to the view, right? We called messages, we said go ahead and prepend this HTML code and show it, which is great. But we didn't yet add in the username, and now it's all still guests. And we have access to that, so we should probably add in the username and not just be sending out a bunch of guests. Well, how do we have that? So messages channel, right, is now how we're handling the message, and it inherits from ActionCable channel. So if we look up app channels, we see ActionCable channel. This is our basic channel. It gets used, right, inherited, very basic. There's also a connection, and I said before, right, remember the connection is the underlying data transfer between the server and the client. And the channel has one connection and keeps that connection open. It actually keeps it open for the entire length that you're logged in or you're connected. So it doesn't refresh it, it doesn't close it, open a new one. It keeps one connection open for the length of time, and then when you exit out or you disconnect, you set a disconnect single, it'll go ahead and close that connection. You see here though the connection, it has identified by current user, and it uses that to keep track of who the connection belongs to. Very similar to before when we used Devise, or our own authentication, right? We had application controller, right? So before we had application controller, and we have helper method current user, right? Very similar. Very similar concept to connection. We've identified by current user. One thing to note is it uses cookies as opposed to sessions. So before we used sessions, and now we're starting to use cookies. It's a similar concept, but the cookie has different ways of interacting with it. So there's cookies.signed, which encrypts your cookies. There's also cookies.encrypt. I think we pull up here. I think this was a good, yeah, so there's two different ways of doing it. There's cookies.signed and .encrypted. When you send cookies.signed, the user can see the value, but they're not allowed to change it. Essentially, it sends along like a signature as a hash, and if any value is changed, then the signature, it basically validates the information. And encryption is when the data is encrypted and it's prevented from tampering with. So you can't really see what's going on the data. And it uses the secret in the secrets file, so secrets.secret keybase. So if we open up our secrets.yaml, you'll see here that we have some secrets. Remember, it's always a good idea not to keep production secrets in your code base because those with Git can live forever. So you want to define those outside of your code base, but in development, it's perfectly okay to define that here. Not a big deal. But let's see if we can find. Yeah, so that is how we get access to our user using cookies, and the cookies last a while. Just a different way of doing authentication, but very similar to sessions. So we have this current user, and right, some of you may have tried to log in without signing in. So if we try to not sign in, right, here it says online users, and it shows us none. And it says log in to see. And I try to send a message. Let me see if I pull up. I'll refresh, and it disconnected, right? So without being logged in, it's disconnected me from our ActionCable, so I won't receive notifications. And it submits the message, but we're disconnected, so it won't actually show up. And right, it won't actually show up. So it requires authentication. So because of that, we have confidence that the current user is always defined. So when we create our message, right, message controller, we can just say equals current user. If we had a doubt if the current user could be nil, right, we could just like user, if current user dot present, right. Another way of doing that is current user. You can ask for .try, and .try is a nice Ruby shortcut. Or it's actually, sorry, it's a Rails shortcut. If you call a current user dot username, right, and current user is nil, this will throw an exception. It will say cannot find property username on object nil. If you do current user dot try, it basically protects against that situation. So if the current user is nil, this would just return a nil as well. It won't throw an error. In this case, though, we have absolute confidence that the current user is always defined. So we can go ahead and say current user dot username. And then on the front end, when we send our request, right, we no longer need to send in a username. Great. So if we refresh, now it shows up as being sent for me. Right? So if anyone now sends a message, the username shows up. We're no longer just a bunch of guests. We're actual people, and you can start to see what's going on. Right? So here we basically demonstrated a lot of things. We've demonstrated, right, sending a message, updating the UI, receiving webhooks. So we basically have done most of the stuff, right? Does that mean we're done? No, there's always more to do. But maybe we want to do some more things with deleting a message. But first, let me see if I can show off the cookies. Let's see what happens if I go here. There's found my cookies. All right, I won't bother. But if you bother to find your cookies, maybe I can find it here. Here we go. So here's our cookie, and you notice that it the key is the name of our application. Right, it will always add in the name of the application, and then the value is just some long thing. So it's encrypted, so we can't actually see the value of the information. Right, it just looks at some generic hash. We have really no idea to kind of look at the information. So this is the cookie that gets passed back and forth with the request, and that's how it knows that I'm Niraj and I'm not Eric or I'm not Min, right? Based off the value of the cookie. But if we were to modify this, then this would throw an exception because it's also assigned. So the signature then is off because it would calculate a new signature, and that wouldn't match the signature that it recognizes. So it's off. But if we have access to the cookie like this, we could actually send our own requests. So I believe if you do curl-i, and then you can send in something like --cookie, I think. And you can then set the cookie or something like that. And so you can still send a request if you have access to the cookie. But just something to think about. Great. So coming back to our here, right? We had a form for, right? So we've seen multiple ways to create and send information to the server, right? The first is form for, just very basic, form for @user that sends a request, creates the object, and expects a view back. The second was form for remote true, which is right here, right? Which sends an asynchronous request. So it sends a request, but it doesn't expect a view back. Instead, it'll keep the user on the same view. And so rather than expect some HTML back, it just stays in the same view. The third way was here we're using just JavaScript, right? So we didn't really use Rails helpers for this one. We had just JavaScript, we had a basic input, and then we defined in rooms.js here, right, we said, all right, when the document loads on a certain element, right, the message body, define a function on what event? Well, the key up event, we'll define this function. So when you press enter, it'll go ahead and send the data and do what we want to do. Right, so there's three different ways of kind of sending data from the client to the server. And it always depends on the use case, what you're trying to do. Right, there's different pros and cons of each approach. In this case, we wanted to send a request through ActionCable. So we had to use app.messages.createMessage, right? That is our interface through ActionCable, going through messages.js. So we decided to use custom JavaScript, and that works. So we have some decent functionality. We have a username, we have a message, but maybe we want to delete a message, right? Maybe you want to say, hey, that message, I don't like that. Let's delete it, and let's send out a notification for that. So let's go ahead and define that. So in our partial here, this defines how our message looks. We'll define a button close. Let's see if we get that button to show up. Great, so now we have a button to show up, but there's really nothing that happened so far, right? All we have is a button, and if we click on it, right, nothing happens. So we want to attach some action to it. In a similar way as before, right, we're going to define some function here that's going to listen to the button and go ahead and do some action. So here we have an ID delete message. That's also not very specific, right? So if we inspect this element here, right, we have here our element. We have information, but we don't want to delete any old message, right? Let's say I want to delete a very specific message. We want to make sure we pass up that ID, so we only delete that message and not some other random message. And if we inspect here our HTML, we really don't have currently a good way of doing that. There's no kind of identifier for that message. So let's go ahead and remove that, and we're actually going to say data message ID, and here it's just going to be the message.id. And then class, we'll say JS delete message, so we can identify it. So now in rooms, we're going to want to actually look for that object, JS delete message, right? And on click, we're going to want to define an event. So we have our function, and it takes an event, right? So we have here, let's just see if we can actually console.log that and make sure we have things hooked up properly. Deleting message. So we'll refresh. Deleting message. Great. So we have our action identified. Let's go ahead and get the information. So again, we're going to use a const because we're not going to change this variable after we create it. And again, we're going to use jQuery. We're going to get this element that we're currently in. And I believe we can get data message ID. And we'll just verify that. Oops. I guess so. So let's just see what happens if we click on this message. Okay, great. Deleting message with ID 68, 69, right? So now we've added into the HTML the message ID here, right? Data message ID. So we can keep track of which message we want to delete. And then in our JavaScript, we've asked for using .data, the message ID, and we can display that. So now we can go ahead and send that to the server. And we've seen this before, right? app.messages.delete message. And we're actually going to send up the ID. Great. And that's all we need to do. So now that we've done this, we need to find that function on the server. So we'll go to our messages channel. We have create message. We'll define delete message. And it takes in a message ID. The Rails way of defining variables is lowercase with underscores to break them apart. And the JavaScript way of using things is camel case. I guess different ways of doing things. So we've defined delete message here, and we actually also need to find it in our interface, which is messages.js, right? This is our interface between the front end and the back end. So we have message ID, and we'll say this dot perform, delete message ID. Great. So in our channel, here we have a message ID. And what should we do? Well, we should probably find that message. So we should probably say message equals message dot find, and we want to find the params. Actually, in this case, we want to find just message ID. Let's see if we can find that. Great. So we'll just actually delete message. And we'll go back here, and we no longer need create message, and so we want to look for delete message. So we'll have a way to inspect our logs. Alrighty. Unexpected identifier. Comma. Data, comma. Connected. Cool. Let's say I want to delete that message. I'll click on it. It said delete message. Oh, didn't delete. Let's check our logs. We didn't even get there. Here it says cannot execute command. Unknown attribute error. Unknown attribute action. So it looks like it's setting up data body action create message. What? Oh, this is before. Oops. And here we go. No complicit version of string and integer. So we actually have to send up not just the ID, but we have to send it up as a hash. So here we'll say ID is message ID. And then the channel, we'll expect in data, and we'll say find data ID. Great, so we have ID here, and we expect to see ID on the other side. We'll go ahead and clear out these logs, and we'll try it again. And let's see. So delete message. Great. So it looks like it deleted the message. Or sorry, it found the message to delete. Delete message is here. So that means we successfully passed up the right ID and we found the message. So now that we've found it, what should we do with it? Well, we should destroy it. We'll go ahead and say add message. Right? Go ahead and destroy it. And we should probably broadcast to everyone that we've deleted it. So ActionCable.server.broadcast. Send it to the room. And we'll send back deleted ID. And we'll send back the ID of the message we deleted. Right? Great. Message, send back deleted ID. But how are we going to handle that? Right? That comes back to here. And so far, all I want to say is receive data. And we're going to try to add it in as a new message. Because that's all we really handle. Right? But if we send this request back, it'll go back to that same function. Except this time we're trying to delete a message, not show a message. So we should instead handle that. So we can say, if data.message, right? If it contains a message field, we'll go ahead and act accordingly, like that. And maybe then we'll say, if data.deleted ID, we should go ahead and delete the message. So we got to find the message. So we have to find the message. We got to figure out what goes in there, and then we got to say remove, right? So what goes in there? Well, we need to find the message, and all we have is the ID. So this is showing the rooms, and this shows the messages, right? So we got to find the messages, and we go to the partial, and we have here an ID, but it's only on the delete field. We also need to add it into the top so that we have access to it. So we're going to add in an ID field up here, so we actually can go ahead and identify ourselves. And we're going to say DOM ID, and then we're going to say message. Let's see what that looks like. It is. So now that we've defined DOM ID, it essentially adds up here in the div message underscore 69. So it took the ID of the message and added it as an ID, which makes it easy to find. And so if we inspect another message, we see here each one has its own message ID. It's fantastic. So we can delete the message by looking for the ID with message, right? And then we need to look at the data.deleted ID. Great. So we'll try that. And delete the message. It's disappeared. And to verify, we actually can look at here the logs, and it actually went ahead and right, the message is here, and message ID is 69. So if we were to look for that, right, messages, right, it'll throw an error because it couldn't find it. And so now if we want, we can start delete messages, right? And we send the request, and then we get a response back, not through the server immediately, but the response comes through the webhook, right? So it's broadcasting out to everybody, hey, there's an object here, the deleted ID is 65, And then when we receive that request, we say, great, we have some data as deleted ID. Go ahead and remove that from the view, right? So it's not just me deleting it here. If you are also looking at your pages and you refresh and you get the latest code, right? If I delete it, it'll go ahead and delete it from you as well, right? And so it's pretty cool as you start to delete messages and it'll delete it on someone else's page, right? You add in messages, you start to delete things, and it pushes that out as a subscription to everyone as opposed to just simply right, a simple HTTP response. You send a request, get a response back. This is broadcasting it out to everybody. So now we delete messages. Great. Now the last thing you may be wondering is we kind of hard coded in a bunch of places the room ID. Let me clear out a bunch of file. So we have our channel, and we have our control, our channel on the right, and here we have room ID is 3. And so far we've been kind of hard coding that in places, and all we have is one subscription, just to stream from room. So right now, if you're on a different room, you would still get the same messages, right? We only have really one way to do that. You subscribe to the room. You just it's one channel for all the different rooms. You get the message even if you're on a different room. So now we want to add in the room ID, and this part gets pretty tricky because we here are using right, JavaScript, and we're not really using the Rails helpers to get access to that. We also here have defined right, our JavaScript to kind of send messages to and from. So we need to start thinking about how we get access to the room ID on the front end. So the first way we can do that is we'll have to create different, add as a parameter, so that we can start to create different channels per room. So that when you subscribe, you're only actually subscribing to that room's notifications and not someone else's. So we'll define the channel there, and we can define here a room ID, and we'll say that room ID is 3 as a parameter. So in our channel then, when we start to here, right, instead of asking for 3, we can ask for the information that comes from here. And where is this information? It's in the channel. And so to do that, we'll say params equals, and then we'll inspect the params and make sure that we can actually get access to the information. Exit out of that. Cool. Clear out that. Let's go ahead and try to create a message. Let's see what we get. So here we have create message. We have message parameters, which is what we passed up, which is the body, and we have an action. We also have params, and this is what we defined in the JS. We have a channel, and then we have the room ID. And you notice that comes from up here, right? This first section is the parameters that send up with the request. So we have a channel and the room ID. So when we create our message, we can just ask for params, and the way it's defined is room ID with the string. So we can do that. Now we say set the room ID to be the room ID that comes back with the parameters. Now we want to start streaming from certain rooms. We want to break out our channel into different rooms. So to do that, we're going to also do the same thing up here. We're going to say params room ID, and I'm actually going to move this into its own function. So we're going to call this broadcast topic. Right, cool. And we'll say here room, and then the params room ID. Right, so we stream from the broadcast topic, which essentially is this guy. The reason we define it as such is similar thing here. When we broadcast to the room, we no longer want to broadcast to the room. We actually want to broadcast to the topic. So we'll actually define that there, put that there, and put that there. Right. So the broadcast topic is the room, and then underscore with the room ID. So you subscribe to a specific topic, and then you get broadcasted out to that same topic. So we've kind of on the server side now taken care of the room ID, but the client needs to know which channel to subscribe to, right? It needs to know the room ID so that it knows how to work with it. So this is our show view for rooms, room show, and so we need to tell this one, which room to subscribe to. So here, right, it's our messages. We're gonna have to do some setup. So we'll say setup room. We'll give it a class identifier so we can actually find it. And then we also need to add in some data here. So we need to add in the data and we need to add in the room ID so we know what to look for. And this is an ERB file, so that means we have access to our Rails helpers. So here we can say room.id. So we pass this data file, and then we have set up here our class JS setup room. And you notice we call it the class JS. That's just because we were letting us and other people know that the class name has no CSS attached to it. Instead, we want to use this to identify this div and add in some JavaScript. And we saw it before, right, with JS delete message. So in the message partial, we added in here the same thing. The class is JS delete message, and that's basically letting us know that this class is not a CSS class. It's a class that is meant for JavaScript purposes, so we can identify this div and start to use it. Same thing right here we just did, right? We added in JS setup room. So now in the room, we want to add in, set up the room, and we're actually going to say .each because we have multiple of these, and so we have a function that's going to loop over each one and set it up. Great. So what should we do? Well, we're going to look for the room ID, and that comes from when we access our elements. And how do we define the room ID? We defined it as here, room ID. So we're going to ask for that first, .data, room ID, and I'm going to print that out. So we know what to do. And the last thing, so we'll set it up. So if we go ahead and refresh the page, we'll see that it's set up, the room ID is 3, which is good. So our code got executed, right? We correctly identified, we passed in the ID, we identified it, and we have access to it here. Now we actually need to go ahead and set it up. So in messages, right, the last thing we do is, this is hard-coded. We need to get here the room ID and pass this in, right? Once we get the room ID here, the rest will fall into place because the server already has separated itself out in different topics. It already uses the room ID to save the message, and it broadcasts out the topics to specific room IDs. So the server is all taken care of, and now we've set it up so that when we go ahead and create it, we need to, when we open the page, it'll call this and it'll get the room ID. Final step is to put the room ID there and register ourselves for that specific topic. So the way we can actually do this is we don't know it initially, but we can do it after the page loads. So we can define this as a function, set up room messages, and we'll say this is a function, and it takes in the room ID, right? And then here we'll place this with our room ID. So now this is entirely a function, and so it won't get, right? Before we refresh the page, we get access to app.messages, right? And that gives us access to all these different functions. Now we're putting it behind a function that has to get called. Oops. So the function won't get run automatically. It'll only get called, and all these become available to us when we call this function. So if we refresh the page, right, we try to create a message, and say can't read property create message, because we have yet to actually run that function, right? Once we run this function with the room ID, these things start to come into play. So if we ask for setup room messages with 3, now we say great, now we're connected. And now if we send a message, right, we're connected, we can receive messages, send messages, that's fantastic. The final thing is we have to actually manually call that, and instead we want to automatically have that come true. So this function right here is what we're going to use, right? It's going to go through, loop through each room, and it will ask for us to get the message, get the room ID. And so the last thing we need to do is say window.setup, how did I call it? Setup room messages, right? And pass in the room ID. right? So we'll loop through, and this only runs after the page is loaded, so we have access to all the information. We'll say loop through each, loop through this here. So get the div of all the different rooms, loop through them, set up the room messages so that we have access to the room ID. Go ahead and call this functionality, this function, which then gives us access to app.messages. So that seems like everything is correct. Let's see if it works. So now we have setting up room IDs 3. Great. We see messages connected. That's looking promising. And we can send messages. And with any luck, it won't actually send them to other rooms. So let me check out this room. Someone said it a room. Right, send a room. And if we go to a different room, it won't actually, right? It only send the message subscription out to this topic, to this room, and not to the other rooms out there. So we've segmented out rooms, and so you can now, when you log in, right, it'll, if you notice here when I go home, right, let's say I add, Ruby 3, it'll set them up. We're already connected, so it doesn't have to reconnect. But this room, the first time we're visiting the room, setting it up, great. And it says messages connected. That means we've gone ahead and connected ourselves to this specific topic. And we can start to receive messages from the server. All right, so to recap, we can send a message to the server. It'll save it. It'll broadcast it out to everyone. It includes the username because we have access to that when we sign in. And we can delete a message if we don't like something. If we don't like a simple message, we can go ahead and delete it and then broadcast that out as well to everyone. We know how to handle these messages back on the server and on the client. So when the client receives these messages, it knows how to both add a new message to the view and it knows how to delete a message that's already in the view. And then finally, we added in the room ID as a parameter. So we can start to create separate topics per each room. And then we only subscribe to specific rooms. So if you're in a room, you get the messages for that room and not the messages in some other room. Are there any questions on that? Yeah, let's go here first. Right. So here we have, so this is Ruby and Ruby 2, right? Let's go ahead and let's refresh and see what happens. So refresh both. We'll see here it says setting up room ID 1, right? So it's connecting us here to this room, only this room, and here's connecting us to this room. So if I send a message from Ruby 2, right, I'll get that message here, and it adds it here, and we see, get the message, great, perfect. We come back, and it's a different topic, right? So this message here won't actually, we won't see it because we're not getting messages for that room. Question here? Yeah. I mean, all this does is it gives you access to these functions, right? Calling setup room messages. Do you want to say something about that? No. Okay. So if you call this, you get access to all this functionality, which is basically just sending messages and deleting messages, which you have access to anyway through the UI. It's not, right? So let's say for example, I pass in some gibberish, right? It'll connect me to this topic, but that room doesn't exist, so nothing's publishing on that channel. Like this. Yeah, I guess you start to get the message information. So we subscribed ourselves to a different message room, and then we received the information here. That's a good point. It might be. I guess if the user is looking around in the console and playing around, they'd have to know what to look for. Um, but if they find it, I guess they could subscribe themselves to different topics. Good question. Um, Not that I'm aware of. I'm sure there's a way. So I think, right, we have this function here that gets called um, on page load. We go through and call it. I think we can define it in a way without defining it on the window. So that only things have access to it. But I'm not quite sure exactly how to do it, how to define it so that it's not globally accessible. Because the function here is globally accessible. So I think there's a way. I'll look it up and let you know. But I don't remember how to do it right now. That's part of just JavaScript, I think. Is um, yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So remember when we reload the pages, right? We have different tabs open. Here we're setting up a subscription to room ID 2, right? And this one then is room ID 1. So we subscribe to different streams uh, in the channel, right? So when we describe to the channel, you subscribe up here, right? You say stream from with a certain room number. And so you're listening out for messages on that stream. How can you view the message? Sorry, can you ask me again? Yeah, it'll render the partial, return it back as HTML. Just the message body. So yeah, so right in the channel here, we have data rendered. I also can do data, message or like message body, right? Just the plain text body, right? If I do that, let's go ahead and refresh, right? This is my message. We see here now we get received data, and now the body field is there as well. So, right, the object we're passing back can be defined however we want. It's like a custom object. We chose to define it as a hash that had two fields on it, rendered, right, with the HTML. But you can add in whatever you want. You can add in body, and you'll see here that rendered and body. In this example right now, nothing is actually listening to this key, so it just comes back and nothing handles, right? All we really cared about is this rendered on the front end. So right here, in the room, so received message, right? We said data.message.rendered, right? But if we wanted to, we could also, for example, someone sent this message, and then print out, data.message.body, right? So you have a lot of freedom to what you want to do with the messages, right? It's up to you.